Hi, my name is Jess Mayrer. I'm the Trauma-Informed Professional Development Coordinator at the DCYF Early Learning Division. Thanks for joining me today as we talk about Fair Start for Kids Act, trauma-informed and healing-centered supports. I'm really excited about this work, and I hope you are too. So what we'll do today in this fairly brief discussion is we'll give you a little bit of background about how we came here. DCYF came here to be growing trauma-informed supports and also healing-centered supports. We'll talk also about some foundational concepts and ideas behind trauma-informed and healing-centered work. We'll discuss how much money is available to providers who grow their knowledge in trauma-informed and healing-centered work, and that's basically what we're up to. So we have an exciting opportunity through the Fair Start for Kids Act, which was passed last year, to grow trauma-informed and healing-centered supports. So today, again, we'll just talk about a little bit of background. We'll talk about some foundational concepts behind trauma-informed and healing-centered work. And we'll discuss how much money is available to individual providers who grow their knowledge, skills, and abilities in trauma-informed and healing-centered, the world of trauma-informed and healing-centered work. And so with that, what I'm going to do now is talk just briefly about some foundational concepts and ideas behind trauma-informed care and healing-centered efforts, so we can all have a kind of a shared understanding and language behind the work. And so I like to talk about this roadmap to trauma-informed care, which is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which references this roadmap to the increasing provision of trauma-informed care as the 4 R's. This can be a really helpful way for me to think about trauma-informed work, in that it really emphasizes the fact that we have to have just a basic understanding, a realization of trauma, an ability to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. We want to respond to trauma, and ultimately we want to resist re-traumatization. So let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like specifically. And so we think about the 4 R's as something that can be applied to an organization or a program. I also think about it from the individual perspective. So I try to personally embody these 4 R's. So let's talk that through a little bit. What does that mean? So a trauma-informed entity first realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery. So we just realize that trauma is a challenge for us and that we can recover from it rather. So that's the first R. It's fairly simple, right? You know, we just understand that trauma is in many of our systems. We see it in the early learning system. We see it in the medical profession. We see it in juvenile justice. We see it in child welfare. It's, you know, we see it in a lot of different places. So that's that first R, is just to realize that it's there. It's with us. It's within us. It's within the people who walk alongside us. So that's the first R. The second R is that a trauma-informed entity recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, you know, in the people we serve, whether it be children, also families, you know, ourselves, again, our colleagues. So we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in those folks that we walk alongside. And so what does that mean to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma? It could mean that a child who's expressing behaviors that we find challenging, throwing a fit in a classroom, you know, we may think, if we didn't have a trauma-informed lens, we may think that child is just being a brat, you know, maybe they're just spoiled. However, if we're looking at it from a trauma-informed lens, it could very well be that that child is being triggered by something. They're having a trauma response. And so that's what we're talking about when we discuss recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in the folks we walk alongside. And then the third R is to respond to trauma. A trauma-informed entity fully integrates knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So that's what we're doing right now. We're working to respond to trauma. We're working to infuse or embed trauma-informed supports within our systems. So it's, again, super exciting. We're actually doing this very actively in this third R realm. We are responding by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. And then finally, a trauma-informed entity actively seeks to resist re-traumatization. We do not want to re-traumatize people, and ultimately we want to facilitate healing and learning too. So we want to even move beyond that 4th R. But again, this is a helpful framework. You know, this roadmap can be helpful for us to identify how to move in an increasingly trauma-informed direction. So let's talk about another important way to think about trauma-informed care, and this is also from SAMHSA, and these are called the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. And for each one of these principles, we have safety, trustworthiness, transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and equity. Each one of these key principles of trauma-informed care actually anchor a host of practices, right? So we're moving closer to the provision or the increasing provision of trauma-informed care. So when we think about the safety principle, for example, what are practices that can be put into that bucket? We can think about being at eye level with kids. That's one practice. We can think about making sure kids have a safe space to store their belongings. We can think about making sure there are smooth transitions between classroom activities. When we think about trustworthiness and transparency, what does that mean? It means using jargon-free language. It means doing what we say we're going to do. It means being very transparent in the way we do business with children and families, being authentic even, right? And then moving on to collaboration and mutuality. We can think about collaboration and mutuality even in, for example, developmental screening. When we're working with families to do developmental screening in early childhood, we can think about making sure that we really collaborate with those families about figuring out what their needs are around that screening. And so those are just some specific practices that we can think about as we move, as we follow these road signs to the increasing provision of trauma-informed care. So that's basically what we're talking about with these 6 key principles. I'm going to talk about one other really foundational concept before we start discussing the financial resources available through the Fair Start for Kids Act and how DCYF is working to release those financial resources to individual providers. So with that, let's talk about the healing-centered approach. I really like the healing-centered approach. It's a really important addition to trauma-informed models. It's relatively new on the scene to trauma-informed care, and that it came out in 2018. Dr. Sean Ginwright came up with this healing-centered model. And so I'll read to you what's on the slide here because it really emphasizes that trauma-informed and healing-centered work is a holistic approach. It's not something specifically that we can say, hey, you early childhood providers, you need to do this, while DCYF does not. It's something that we need to embrace within our own programs and agencies and also embody externally when we're working with children, youth, and families. So according, as Dr. Sean Ginwright has stated specifically, a healing-centered approach is holistic. It involves culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. A healing-centered approach views trauma not simply as an individual isolated experience, but rather highlights the ways in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. So it's a really important point there in terms of trauma and healing being experienced collectively. Trauma doesn't usually happen to us when we're alone in a bungalow in Tacoma like I am, right? It happens in relationship. And so as such, trauma should be healed in relationship. And there are opportunities to heal trauma in front of us and with us all the time. Whether we're in a work meeting, we have an opportunity to embrace the healing-centered approach, or when we're working with children and families, we certainly have an opportunity to embrace this approach. So it's just a really vital ingredient within our work that I love to highlight. Another way to talk about the healing-centered approach is that for many years in trauma-informed care, we used to talk about the movement to being trauma-informed as saying we're no longer asking what's wrong with you, but instead we're asking what happened to you. So it used to be that we talked about trauma-informed care as moving to asking what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, talking about that kid who might be throwing a fit. We're not asking what's wrong with you, kid. We're asking what happened to you. But now with the healing-centered approach, we're actually moving to asking what's right with you. So it's a really strengths-based way of approaching this work. And so again, it's just really important to start asking what's right with us and not dwell necessarily on those bad things that have happened. So that's among the reasons why this is such a great way of thinking about the work. So now let's talk about money. So through the Fair Start for Kids Act, again, the Washington State Legislature passed the Fair Start for Kids Act last year, and Section 304 of the Fair Start for Kids Act directs DCYF very specifically to grow trauma-informed supports for early childhood professionals. So providers may receive financial awards for earning specialty credentials per the legislative language, such as a degree in early childhood mental health. And also individual providers may earn financial awards for participating in trauma-informed professional development and training. So DCYF has more than $2 million to award this fiscal year for trauma-informed financial incentives to be provided to individuals who are working with children and families. And we'll talk about who are the eligible providers here in just a minute. And specifically, so we're also investing in new trauma-informed and healing-centered training, screening, and potentially assessments. So some other things happening in the trauma-informed world to be excited about. So who are these providers who are eligible? So individual providers and also owners of childcare facilities, family, friends, and neighbors receiving state subsidy, et cetera. So individuals who are eligible for these awards include licensed and certified providers, coaches, including early achievers coaches, birth to 3 quality initiative coaches, infant early childhood mental health consultants are eligible for training awards specifically, ECAP providers, early ECAP providers, family, friends, and neighbors, as I might have noted already. These also have to be related to accepting state subsidies. So these providers have to be accepting state subsidies too. So just to keep that in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we are figuring out how to grow these supports, and then we'll talk more in detail about how we're working to distribute the financial awards to individual providers. And so DCYF is increasingly embracing what's called a liberatory design model. It's a project design process. So we're engaged through these growing trauma-informed and healing-centered supports and project design. And so the liberatory design model really squares quite nicely with our efforts. And so the idea behind liberatory design is that it emphasizes co-design. So we're working with providers and families to hear what types of trauma-informed supports would be helpful. And so we're working to shift power through co-design, through listening to providers, asking providers what is needed, asking families what is needed to be trauma-informed. We're really working to emphasize the folks who are impacted making decisions in this work. So the idea here is that, we're designing for equity, which requires meaningful participation from those most impacted. So with that, let's talk about how we've been doing this, how we've been shaping our supports. So we will be working with families to co-create trauma-informed professional development practices. We are also working with providers. We had a June co-design session with providers, asking providers what types of trauma-informed and healing-centered supports would be helpful. And I'll talk more about what we learned through that effort here in a moment. And then we're also working with DCYF staff and subject matter experts to figure out what types of supports are needed. And so that's just a little bit of a roundup. You can tell my voice is a little hoarse. I've been talking to everybody, listening to everybody about what types of supports are needed. So I noted that June design session. We've also been meeting with the Early Learning Advisory Council. We've been meeting with Tribal Policy Council. We've been meeting with the Indian Policy Education folks. We've been working with the Outdoor Nature-Based Competencies Advisory Group. So we've been talking to just everybody and hearing like what types of supports are needed. And so I'm just going to share one word cloud. This is what we heard specifically in the June provider design session. We asked them, what types of trauma-informed training would be needed, what types of financial awards would be most helpful, like how should we distribute that more than $2 million? And so this word cloud that we're looking at is how providers answered what types of trauma-informed supports are needed. So they talked about, for example, making sure that folks working with children and families understand mandatory reporting and cultural considerations around trauma, how to do early trauma intervention. We heard from providers that they wanted to learn more about how to engage in mutuality, how to work with different people, how to make sure we understand protective factors, how to grow protective factors to fend off the impacts of trauma. When we attended IPEL too, I like to say, we heard from the folks at IPEL that DCYF staff needs individual trauma-informed training. And so we're making sure that trauma-informed and healing-centered training is available to early childhood professionals, and I'll talk more about that here in a minute, but also to DCYF staff and contractors. So we are really working to co-design this effort to grow supports. So with that, let's talk about what we heard from providers in June. So we heard from providers in June that they'd like a tiered payment structure in recognition for individuals who grow their trauma-informed knowledge, skills, and abilities. So what we're doing here, and let's start with the first tier. So we are currently creating, and I just alluded to that a minute ago, we're creating at DCYF with our partners at Cultivate Learning, a trauma-informed and healing-centered foundational training, which we're wrapping into childcare basics. So we're not adding any more hours to childcare basics, just to be very clear about that. We're not adding any more time to childcare basics, but we are wrapping in this foundational trauma-informed and healing-centered training into it. And again, that's the same training that we'll be providing to DCYF staff and contractors. So that's really exciting for me. And then as we move into this tier 2 category, that's when we'll start administering or distributing financial awards to individuals who grow their knowledge. And so let's talk what that looks like through. Specifically, individual providers who take pyramid model 1 and 2 training will be eligible if they're those providers that we discussed a little bit earlier, and they're still employed and they satisfy the various criteria, will be eligible for $800 financial award. And I do like to highlight that this is newer pyramid model content created by the Herring Center and Cultivate Learning, not the older pyramid model content, because the newer content is much more trauma-informed and much more focused on anti-racist and anti-bias practices. So just to highlight that we're talking about the new pyramid model. Another nuance here with the pyramid model too is you'll note that pyramid model is down here as well. And that's for pyramid model implementation site practitioners. And so those individuals, you may know that DCYF is launching pilots of the pyramid model in early childhood classrooms. And so this larger award is for those folks who are actually part of the implementation sites. So just to be really clear about that. Conscious discipline to those individuals who take conscious discipline, 10 hours of the training with learning application supports may be eligible for an $800 award. Mobility mentoring for ECAP folks, for family support professionals within ECAP, mobility mentoring could very well warrant an award. And then filming interactions to nurture development too is potentially eligible for an award if you're one of those providers who we discussed in the eligibility criteria categories. So, and then moving up to Cultivate, the new Cultivate Learning Trauma-Informed Care Training, which is fairly intensive, that warrants a potentially $1,200 award. Prepare for Care, also really great content. And then we'll be working to recognize potentially more trainings or endorsements through this effort, including the Washington Association of Infant Mental Health endorsements. We've heard that that should be recognized. So throughout this fiscal year, we'll likely be growing this list. I do want to emphasize too that currently we are recognizing as a college degree, a bachelor's degree or higher in infant early childhood mental health. That's the only degree option currently we're recognizing. It sticks very close to the legislative language. And that's why we're recognizing that degree right now. With an education award of $1,200. And I do want to note a couple of different aspects of this is that we are capping all of the awards at $1,200. So for example, if you took pyramid model, this one in the emerging category, and then went on to take Prepare for Care, you would receive $800 for pyramid model and then an additional $400 capping out at $1,200. Also, we are applying these awards retroactively, going back in some cases several years, if the training was provided with learning application supports. So just to be very clear, all of these trainings to warrant an award have to be with learning application supports, such as coaching, a community of practice, or homework. All of these trainings here currently do provide those learning application supports. So when we're thinking about retroactive awards, similarly, the training must have had the learning application. So just keep that in mind too, as you're wondering if you could be eligible for these. So, so I think those are the high points. We're also hearing too, some other trainings or endorsements that could be included in this list, potentially some offerings from the Barnard Center, and then some individual college degree options that can be offered outside of a degree track too. So keep in mind through this fiscal year, again, this list may very well be growing. So let's look at our timeline for releasing these awards. And so to highlight that we are engaging in the rulemaking process for compensation. It's an ongoing process, and basically the rule is basically says DCYF DCYF will release these financial awards to individual providers who gain new knowledge, skills, and abilities in the trauma-informed world. And that's basically what the rule says. So it's nothing fancy, and that process is ongoing right now. And we are working to communicate more broadly our existing education and training recognized for financial awards. That's part of this effort right now, sharing the information with you. And then we're working right now to distribute also awards to those eligible providers in early 2023. And I should say that providers should be made aware of their eligibility by way of the training contractors. So the way we're envisioning the payments to be distributed is through the individual contractors who provided the training. So for example, with the Cultivate Trauma-Informed Care training, Cultivate should be reaching out to those individuals who are eligible for an award, who took the training, and saying, hey, you're eligible, and this is what the award will look like. So we're hoping to have all of that moving in early in 2023. And then, one of the challenges with this work is the legislature has directed DCYF to provide awards to individual providers who are trauma-informed. However, we don't really have an objective way to do that at this point. We've gone through these trainings and we've identified, one college degree offering, and we're like, yeah, that looks pretty trauma-informed. It satisfies those key principles. It furthers the 4 Rs. But at this point, we ultimately don't have an objective way to determine if individual providers are trauma-informed. And so throughout this fiscal year, we'll actually be articulating, with input from so many community partners, we'll be articulating standards for the provision of trauma-informed and healing-centered work. So really spelling out what it looks like to be trauma-informed, and using those standards that we articulate as a way to identify strengths, and to provide financial awards, et cetera. So that's an effort that'll be ongoing this fiscal year, in which we work to articulate what does it really mean to be trauma-informed on the ground. And then again, early in 2023, we'll be growing potentially our list of trainings and educational offerings that warrant awards. So that's basically what we're talking about. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about our financial award process and DCYF efforts to grow trauma-informed and healing-centered supports. And I just want to thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.